Thanks, Ray. My name is Andrew Grenville. I'm the Chief Research Officer at Meru Matchbox. And what I want to talk about today is the importance of context. So the sentence is, he blew it. So what does that mean? Did he make a mistake that led to failure? Or are we learning how he created this beautiful glass vase? We know that in that context is everything. What I want to speak to you about is a chapter from a book I've recently published called The Insights Revolution, Questioning Everything. And in that book, I interviewed about 35 insights professionals from around the world, some marketers, some strategists, and one of those people was the NewMR's Ray Pointer. And so I will share with you some of the things that I learned from these great researchers from around the world in this presentation. But let's just start off with this. What is this dot? Is it the moon in eclipse? Or is it a tiny black hole with a really intense gravitational pull? Or is it the black dot from Treasure Island that so scared the pirate Billy Bones that he had a stroke and he died? Or is it simply the dot at the bottom of a question mark found at the end of this sentence? What is it? We can't tell. It's completely impossible without context. And in our world of survey research, we often do single one-off surveys in isolation, and we fail to have good, rich context around it. And I think that's a problem. We need to start thinking beyond the survey. Now here's another example. Is this young man winking or blinking? This is a very famous example of the need for context and thick description that comes from British philosopher Gilbert Rye. In a 1968 lecture, Rye stated, "Two boys fairly swiftly contract the eyelids of their right eyes. In the first boy, this is only an involuntary twitch, but the other is winking conspiratorially to an accomplice. At the lowest or thinnest level of description, the two contractions of the eyelids may be exactly alike. From a cinematograph film of the two faces, there might be no telling which contraction, if either was a wink, or which, if either, was a mere twitch. Yet there remains the immense but unphotographable difference between a twitch and a wink." Understanding that is what Rye calls a thick description, one that has multiple layers of information. But without context, you can't tell a wink from a blink. And I'm going to show you a clip from Seinfeld that riffs off this notion that is a common example in anthropological circles. And Kramer and George have just had breakfast, and Kramer accidentally squirted grapefruit juice into George's eye, and this is burning in his eye, and it causes him to blink involuntarily. But I think this clip underscores just how important it is to have context. So let's have a look.
By the way, you got that birthday card?
Birthday card?
Mr. Steinbrenner's birthday card. Wilhelm said you'd have it for me to sign.
Oh, yeah, whoa, I have that for you right after lunch.
Fine, I'll be back after my massage.
Of course, your massage. Enjoy your massage. Like I'm gonna risk my job with the New York Yankees to make a few extra bucks.
No, of course not. Well, Mr. Weatherby.
Kramer, do you have that Yankee envelope?
I sure do.
Oh.
There you are.
Hey.
You're going to be very pleased when you see what's inside.
What is this?
Your cut of the loot? Stubbs gave me $200 for the autographed birthday card that was inside.
Who told you to sell the card?
You did.
No, I didn't.
Well, not in so many words, but I believe we had an understanding.
I was not winking, you idiot! That was the grapefruit! It's like acid! I need that card back. It's Mr. Steinbrenner's. I was responsible.
Well, Stubbs already sold it to some guy whose kid is in the hospital.
Well, get it back! It's very important!
Look, you want me to get it back or not?
Get it back!
By the way,
I
you
think
got that
it's
birthday card?
a lovely
Birthday card?
example, pardon me, of how important it is to have insights that are not born in isolation. I think a single study, a single result from a study can give you an answer to a question. So, did the ad pass our benchmark or not? That's an answer to a question, but it's not an insight. An insight is much richer. The Cambridge Dictionary has a useful definition. It calls it a clear, deep, and sometimes sudden understanding of a complicated problem or situation. And really, all our business problems that we deal with are complicated and need to be looked at in context. But too often we step back and say, well, let's just get an answer to a question. This whole question of making connections is really where creativity comes. Steve Jobs said, creativity is just connecting things. When you ask how creative people how they did something, they feel a little guilty because they didn't really do it. They just saw something. It seems obvious to them after a while. And that's true about the most powerful of insights. All of a sudden it crystallizes and you see it. And then he said, that's because they were able to connect experiences they've had and synthesize new things. And that's critically important. But often in our world of market research, we think that we can just go ahead and present the results of a study. And Ray has this great quote. One of the weirdest things that market researchers do is present a report that is solely based on the piece of research that they just conducted. What amazing hubris to assume your research project on its own is going to answer any meaningful question. And that is true. I mean, but the question we need to ask ourselves is, if context is so obviously important, why are so many studies commissioned and executed in complete isolation? Now, most research reports contain no information other than what was in the study. And most requests for research come with basically the scantest of background information and almost no sense of how the research problem fits into the brand or the organization's bigger picture. That's frustrating for everybody. It's frustrating for the supplier. It's frustrating for the person in market research who just was given an order by somebody in marketing, go do this tracker, go do this message test, without understanding how it fits into the bigger picture. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to push back, to not just take orders, to not just fulfill orders, but to push for context so that we can actually move towards insights and not just executing a study that will give us an answer. The tendency for us to do this has multiple unfortunate roots. I mean, we've ended up here for a reason. Used to be that surveys and market research were one of the only ways you could get information. So it was easy to think of the survey as the solution. But now we've got data coming in from all sorts of places: social media, big data, thousands and thousands of sources are available to us now. And now we have to move from being survey focused into thinking like synthesists. Also, the need for speed often drives people to just go ahead and commission another study. And then there's also the problem of silos within organizations where they just don't talk to each other, and different teams that are touching the customer don't necessarily share information. So there's no context. You may be interested in, say you're an airline. I spoke to somebody from Virgin Atlantic, and his perspective when he moved into the organization, he was in an order taker role, and he saw that the food people looked at the food stuff, the people from the lounge looked at the lounge stuff, the people in the cabin looked at the cabin stuff, and nobody looked at the big picture. And he pushed and lobbied to get that changed because he saw the importance of context. Single slices of information can be misleading. And it's not just surveys. If you look at something in isolation, whether it's big data or whether it's some other data source, you need to synthesize. And I've got a good story here. But first, a comment from Howard Schimmel, who was the chief research officer at Turner Broadcasting. He said, "I think we've all got a bit mesmerized. Big data and first-party data is great, but it does provide a limited view of the world. I think we've got to do a better job of integrating survey data, panel data, first-party data, and being clear about how it all comes together to provide a solution. Vijay Subramani of US Bank told me a story about behavioral analysis that I think is instructive. She said the company did some data analysis to understand why a certain group of customers were not using their credit card. They said, okay, let's do some behavioral analysis. And they looked at the data, and they found that those who were not using their credit cards had lower credit limits than those who were using their credit cards. So they thought, aha, we've got the answer. The problem's credit limits. Let's increase the credit limits, and then they'll start using the card. But Vidya thought, let's talk to the customers and figure out what kind of credit limit they need. And what they found was, she said, when we spoke to those customers, the majority said, I didn't even know I had this credit card. I didn't sign up for this credit card. Well, it turned out that these customers had automatically been given the card when they signed up for a checking account. So they hadn't asked for the product, she said. There wasn't a need for the product. So giving them a greater credit line would not make them start using the card. She said for her and for her marketers, it was one of those, quote, aha moments when they realized they do need market research. The two approaches go hand in hand. And indeed they do. And it's very important that they do go hand in hand. Because if you look at anything in isolation, it can be misleading. Sometimes it's good to step back too. This is an example from Facebook and Instagram. And Jaideep Mukherjee is a researcher there. He started out in Instagram, has moved over to Facebook. And he said to me, they do a lot of the same studies over and over again, testing ads, see which ones work, which ones don't. They do A/B testing and run thousands of experiments. And he said, we were noticing over time that Instagram ads were performing a little differently than Facebook ads. They were both performing well, but Instagram ads tended to work better at some of the upper funnel metrics, like ad recall or brand awareness. Whereas Facebook ones tended to work a little bit better for things like brand favorability or stated purchase intent. So that was a curious question. We'd noticed this through hundreds of studies. He said, I was able to start looking across what other teams were doing. Some of these teams were using methodologies out of neuroscience. And by pulling these different strands of research together, we realized that people spend more time looking at images on an Instagram ad. And on Facebook, they spend more time looking at the text. And that's a function of how people use those apps. He said, on Facebook, people might be more interested in reading text, whereas on Instagram, it's much more about the visual experience. The ad unit on Instagram has the image first, followed by the text. On Facebook, it's the text first, followed by the image. And that's a really obvious thing, but I don't think anyone had ever stopped to think that through. These ad units, he said, all have the same components, but they're laid out differently. Will that potentially have some impact on how people are perceiving and digesting the ads? Well, clearly it does. I mean, depending upon what your objective is, you may be better off going for Instagram versus Facebook or vice versa. But the only way you could see that is by stepping back and looking at multiple studies, pulling in different strands, the neuroscience data, the eye gaze that would show you where people were looking, where they were dwelling. Those things, that insight can only come when you step back and look at these things in context. So that's, I think, a great example, and I think it speaks to the power of meta-analysis, which we see commonly in places like medicine, where you can take a single study, which might have given you spurious information, and by putting it into context of all the other studies that have been done in that disease area, you can see what true efficacy is and whether a study result might be anomalous. That's obviously, it's important in medicine, but it's also important in the world of insights. So you know the saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And researchers are like that. They answer everything with a survey, and I think we are guilty of that. That's Patrick Comer, the CEO of Lucid. And I think that we can get sucked into thinking that it is the answer to everything. But sometimes it's important to go beyond that. There's a great story that I heard from the head of consumer and customer insights at Nestle India. It was a presentation she made at SMR Congress a couple of years ago. It's called The Power of Cross-Pollination. And they wanted to answer 3 questions. How could they break out coffee in India? Coffee in India has a very tiny share relative to tea. But Nestle has about a 90% share of the coffee market. So it's very much in their interest to grow coffee as a category. And they thought, well, we could go out and we could do our U&A and we can do a driver's analysis and find out basically things they already know, that people aren't as comfortable with coffee, that people are very comfortable with tea, that tea is well understood. So they thought, okay, we're not going to do the same old, same old. We're going to step away from the survey and we're going to think about this more broadly. And they wanted to find out 3 questions. What can be learned from tea consumption in other tea drinking nations? Why is tea consumption so high in India? And what can be learned from other categories with similar challenges? Great question. So how did they go about doing this? Well, they looked at the history of tea. They looked at how things were happening in other countries. So they looked at Japan and they looked at the UK, where there are tea drinking nations, but there's sizable amounts of coffee being consumed. So by stepping outside their country and looking at other places, they could see that there were cultural forces that occurred. In this case, in both those cases, the presence of American troops in World War II were kind of a seed that started growing the coffee market. And they looked at tea consumption in India and said, why is it so high? And as they looked into it from a historical perspective, they found something very interesting. Coffee, or tea rather, in India has only become popular in the past 50 years. While India was growing tea for the UK for many years and exporting it, very few people were drinking it. And in fact, 50 years back, they found out that tea was viewed as an elitist thing and that it was unhealthy and that it was, no one really knew how to use it. And they looked at what tea had done. Tea had figured out that they needed to help people understand how to make it. Well, the old steep the tea just didn't really fit into people's workflow in India. But when they boiled it, they could know that the water was clean, that had been purified. And so they actually devised a new method for making tea by boiling it in water rather than steeping it. When they did that, it fit into the context. And then they went from village to village, giving out free samples and explaining that it, in fact, was not an unhealthy drink and that it wasn't just for rich people. And that's exactly the situation that coffee's in right now in India, is that it's seen as unhealthy and it's seen as elitist and people don't know how to make it. So they realized that if tea could do it, they could do it, but they'd have to put some boots on the ground and put some effort into it. And then they looked at what could be learned from other categories with similar challenges. And they looked at the world of sweets, of chocolate. And they used a semiotic analysis here. The competition for chocolate, the other sweets, are sweetmeats in India. And they're used in celebrations at temple, birthdays, weddings. They're very much a communal, celebratory type of offer. And so the cultural context, when they looked at it, is that. It's all about celebration and community. But when they looked at what really are we saying, what kind of images are we communicating with chocolate, it was set up as more of a individualistic, sensual, kind of hedonistic use, which is not how sweets are typically used in India. So chocolate was struggling because its code was at odds with the culture. And when they changed the code and made it all about celebration and taking on the same kind of atmosphere as sweetmeats, then chocolate started to really take off. So this is I think a great example of stepping back, not even doing the survey, because the survey probably would have led you to the same old conclusion, but instead looking to other forms of intelligence like history, like semiotics. A great example of thinking outside the survey. So how can we avoid that kind of blinkered approach? I think we need to read and research the markets. We need to spend the time to learn things about the market that is not simply in the survey. We need to be conscious, first of all, that we could have blinders on. We can't really trust single study results, as we saw with that example from US Bank. I think we need to encourage our clients, whether that be our internal clients or whether as a supplier, it's a researcher, to share everything and anything and be voracious about it. It takes more effort, but it really does provide better results. I think we need to question whether the brief that we're getting, should we really take it at face value? Because there could be a better way. If you think about coffee, the simplest thing was, if we want to grow the coffee market, would be to do the U&A and look at the drivers and barriers. But no, they stopped and said, look, let's think beyond that. Let's think about the big picture. How can we really break this open? Also, agile and iterative approaches, blended methodologies, and then asking yourself, really, is a survey necessary? Is there a better way? We have to remember that context is absolutely critical. It's easy for us and our clients to get so focused on the minutia of a study that we really miss the big picture. So let's wrap things up with this dot. On its own, we don't really know what it is. The lack of context renders it easy to put multiple meanings on it. It's ones that could be wildly mistaken. And that can happen with a single piece of research in isolation. Truly, there is power in connecting the dots.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew, how do you suggest we deal with the budget and timing constraints when trying to expand viewpoints, data sources about the research question at hand?
I think that's a great question, because it does mean that if we're going to invest some time and some effort into getting context and getting contextual information, there is a cost of that. And I think it becomes a question of, should we do three things poorly and just answer questions and be reactive, or should we invest some time and do two things well? Also, I think that having context isn't necessarily all that difficult. I think lots of people read things, and what I do, for example, to keep track of information that's shared is, as I read something, I'll copy the URL, I'll paste it into a document, and then I'll go back to those pieces of information and be able to share them so that everyone working on the project can have a little more background, a little more context. But let's be real, we have to change our processes, and we have to decide what's a priority.
Absolutely. And to everybody listening, I thoroughly recommend Andrew's book. It's a good read, and it's not a long read, which also makes it good.
Thanks, Ray.